Balance of Power, live from Washington, D.C.
There we have it, live from Canada. Still answering questions as he walks away. President Trump there with the Prime Minister of the UK, Keir Starmer, following their bilateral conversation, speaking with reporters who were there at the G7 summit. This is live on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew, and we thank you for being with us here on Balance of Power. The president making some news there about a range of issues, beginning with the trade deal that was announced with the UK. This was a redhead on the terminal, says they just signed the trade deal, having not much change from previous iterations of a deal. It sounds like they largely codified the deal that was already in place. Along with me in Washington, D.C. this evening, Bloomberg's Julie Fine. You've been watching this unfold with me over the course of the day here, Julie, and pretty interesting backdrop, of course, considering the weekend of attacks between Israel and Iran to find ourselves talking trade here today in Canada.
It's certainly an announcement, and Joe, it's great to be with you. It's certainly an announcement that the United States wanted to make. Obviously, as you just said, the framework was there, but they come out of the G7 early with something to report, that they solidified a trade deal when tariffs have been such a large deal, as you know, in the United States right now.
Of course, that's right. Let's bring you there now. We go to Alberta. Bloomberg's David Gura covering the G7 summit and following President Trump in his travels. We've got a deal here, David. We heard of 90 deals in 90 days. I guess this is one so far.
This is one, and not a full one. I mean, this is a deal, not a comprehensive trade deal. And just to tick through sort of what was agreed to today, we see tariffs on cars cut from 27.5% to 10%. This is on the first 100,000 exports from the United Kingdom. A reduction in steel tariffs from 25% to 0. And in exchange for all of that, we're likely to see the UK here lifting quotas for beef and ethanol. So as you rightfully pointed out, Joe, just a moment ago, this is essentially codifying or making real that agreement that was announced in broad strokes in the Oval Office just a few weeks ago. You remember the pageantry of that moment, the tableau, President Trump sitting at the Resolute desk, Keir Starmer, who wasn't in London at the time, I believe was at a car factory, piped in by phone and delivering remarks, very positive remarks about the work that President Trump had done. So this kind of brings all of that full circle. The White House here taking a victory lap. But again, this isn't a full comprehensive trade deal. It is something that the U.S. and the U.K. have been working toward for a long time. It's a movement forward here. And what the White House would certainly like is for certainly the other nations gathered here in Canada and those watching to see this as sort of a templatic that they could use this going forward to make deals of their own.
And, David, I do want to ask you, as Joe pointed out earlier, this is, of course, happening with the backdrop of everything happening in Iran and Israel. The president just saying in that news conference that he believed that he was confident Iran would sign a deal. What was your reaction to that, and what are you hearing there?
Julie, it's good to talk to you. And yes, that stood out to me as well. And he can't kind of get away from this issue. It's something that all of these world leaders have been giving statements on and talking about. And indeed, the hope at this summit for many of them was they could all come together, come up with a unified statement they could all sign, and that would send a message to Israel and Iran. And the message would be that they need to de-escalate. Now, the U.S. and President Trump didn't want to sign on to that document. Indeed, they haven't. And so what you heard there from the president as he stood next to the U.K. Prime Minister is him saying the only way forward here is for Iran to sign a deal. He said effectively they are at the negotiating table. They have no other option at this point in time. But I have to remind everyone just of the crucible in which this is happening. This is a conflict that has not subsided in any way over the last few days. If anything, it's heated up even more. So I think that the looming question is, for the U.S., for Israel, for Iran, for all these nations, is how do you begin to get back on that path toward diplomacy in this kind of crucible of crisis when you have really two sides still lobbing very serious weaponry at one another, showing no sign of restraint at all?
Great having you there, David. Bloomberg's David Gura at the G7 in Canada. We'll return back to David a bit later on this hour as we want to keep the beat on one of our top stories, and that is the conflict raging between Israel and Iran after both countries exchanged fire for the fourth consecutive day. The attack itself visible in Iranian state TV. Watch this if you're with us on Bloomberg TV as debris rained down after Israel struck at the heart of Tehran, taking out another top military official. This has fears of an all-out war in the region, stoked fears around the world, including the potential for that this war drag others into the oil-rich region, forcing the U.S. into a more hands-on stance. Quite the moment there on Iranian state TV. with smoke in the studio. America already moving military hardware into the region in preparation for an escalation, despite over 200 casualties in Iran, over 500 injuries in Israel since this conflict reignited. Joining us for more now is Edward Djerejian, former U.S. ambassador to Israel and Syria, senior fellow at Harvard's Belfer Center. Mr. Ambassador, welcome to Bloomberg TV and radio. It's good to see you. As Israel seems to be on the approach of widening its attacks against Iran, we do have reports now today that Iran is looking for an off-ramp. Is it too late?
I don't think it's too late, but I think the battle, the war between Israel and Iran will continue for days and weeks, perhaps, until both sides feel a point of exhaustion. But it's very difficult to predict what that time frame will be. But what I think is really important in all this is, what is the end game? What is the end game for Israel? What is the end game for Iran? And what is the end game for the United States? And I think it's really important that we seek some strategic clarity on what this conflict means and what the U.S. national security interests are. I think if Trump lives up to his basic instincts of not getting the United States involved in a foreign war, we know that's where he's coming from. You heard him just in your previous segment with the British Prime Minister talking about Ukraine, and that he wants the bloodletting to stop. And I think he wants this conflict to stop, and he wants to get the parties, Iran and Israel, back to the negotiating table on the nuclear deal.
Ambassador, what will it take, though, do you believe, to get them there?
Well, first, I think they're going to have to realize both sides, and this may not happen. I mean, we're entering the fog of war, and it's a very dangerous situation, because once we enter into these military exchanges, they can get out of hand, and this conflict can expand. I think the worst case scenario would be that this conflict between Iran and Israel, the missile exchanges, the kinetic successes that Israel has had over Iranian territory and targets, both military personnel and military installations, nuclear installations, this can lead to getting out of hand and involving the region as a whole. That, to me, would be the worst case scenario. And I also think, my personal view, is that it does not serve the national security interests of the United States to get involved in yet another war in the Middle East, especially after we have experienced as a nation our experience in Afghanistan, a forever war. And we saw the end result of that is the Taliban coming back into power. And of course, the 2003 invasion of Iraq, which caused a great deal of destabilization in the region. It did get rid of Saddam Hussein, but again, it had very bad consequences, including the creation and rise of ISIS and more broadened terrorism in the region. So Netanyahu has been, he's been speaking very declaratively that the end game for Israel is that Iran will not get a nuclear weapon. President Trump has said that. I think the international community in general is on board on that. But then the ambiguities is, what does that mean? What does that mean in enrichment capabilities? And what does that mean in terms of an agreement? Are you going to achieve that through military means? That's problematic. Iran has a number of nuclear facilities in its territory.
Yeah. Well, Ambassador, I actually had a chance to talk about those facilities and what Israel is targeting in a conversation today with Ron Dermer, Israel's Minister of Strategic Affairs, former Israeli ambassador to the U.S. You've probably worked together. Here's what he said about the targets that Israel is hitting in Iran as we speak.
Well, it's day 4. We've taken out their main scientists. We've taken out information that they need for nuclear weapons, and then facilities like the Natanz enrichment facility, which is their main enrichment facility. There's a conversion facility that converts the uranium to the stuff that you need in order to produce a bomb. That was taken out. I mean, we're setting them back. We're hitting centrifuge manufacturing facilities, and we have a clear plan over the next several days to degrade and destroy their capabilities to produce and set them back several years.
There are Big questions, Ambassador, about what Israel can do from here without the help of the United States offensively when it comes to Fordo, for instance, to actually getting hundreds of feet underground to the enrichment facilities. Is that something that Israel can do without the U.S.'s help?
It's very problematic. You put your finger on one of the key problems. Is Fordo is a very significant nuclear Iranian site. It's built inside of a mountain, and the conventional wisdom is that the Israelis alone don't have the means to really destroy Fordo. But the United States does have the capability of inflicting great damage on a site like Fordo. But that would involve the United States getting involved in a military action and in the war between Israel and Iran. Then the United States would become an active participant in war. And where will that lead? That is a very sensitive issue.
Edward Djerejian, former U.S. ambassador to Israel and Syria and senior fellow at Harvard's Belfer Center, thank you so much for being with us. And we just heard from President Trump a few minutes ago taking a victory lap with UK's Keir Starmer, telling reporters they just signed a trade agreement. That coming as the Senate releases the text of its long-promised tax bill. That version leaves the issue of SALT unresolved, penciling a limit of only $10,000 and earning sharp criticism from key lawmakers. Republican Congressman Mike Lawler of New York says he won't agree to a penny less than the $40,000 cap in the House version. And Lawler's colleague, Republican Congresswoman Nicole Maliotakis of New York, called the Senate's move a slap in the face. Here with more is Bloomberg's Laura Davison. Laura, thanks so much for being with us. All of this happening right now, as you just saw President Trump taking a victory lap about this trade deal. And now this bill comes down, but there's some problems getting it through. So all of this at a critical time for the president.
Yes, and he's hoping to take a victory lap on this bill by July 4th. But in order to do that, there are several key issues that Republicans really need to hash out. One is the state and local tax deduction, SALT, as you mentioned. It's not really an issue in the Senate. There are no senators that really care about SALT, no Republican senators at least. But if they want to get this done quickly, the bill has to go back to the House. So these House lawmakers that care a lot about SALT are going to have to vote on the bill again, and they're threatening to block it if there isn't, a SALT cap that's somewhere around that $40,000 mark that they negotiated in the House version.
Are they just filling in a blank here, Laura, knowing that this will be addressed later in conference committee, or did we really just go back to start on SALT? Because we've got a lot of viewers and listeners wondering how much things just changed.
This $10,000 number, this is a placeholder for now. This is, negotiations are continuing on SALT. In fact, in just a couple hours, senators are going to go behind closed doors and continue these conversations about SALT. But what this does suggest is that the senators are going to drive a hard bargain here. They're not going to just accept the House's proposal.
Yeah.
And Laura, it's such a short timeline now. I mean, we've been hearing July 4th for months, but July 4th is a few weeks away and they have a long way to go. What happens if they don't hit this deadline?
If they don't hit this deadline, nothing explodes. There is no major problem. But where they do start running into issues is they need to meet an early to mid-August deadline. That is when the debt ceiling runs out. This bill that the Senate just put out would increase the debt ceiling by $5 trillion. And so that is the real drop-dead deadline. July 4th, though, if they don't meet that, that would be a little bit wounding their pride of saying that they set up this deadline. They've been talking about it for months. And if they blow right past it, it will really shake their confidence in their own party.
We're just getting started here, it seems like, all over again. Bloomberg's Laura Davison. Thank you, Laura, so much for bringing us up to date. Another story that we're following here at Bloomberg, the fatal shooting of a top Minnesota lawmaker. It was quite a weekend. The suspect, Vance Butler, was arrested Sunday night after a two-day manhunt, faces state and federal murder charges now related to the assassination of Minnesota State Representative Melissa Hortman and her husband, as well as the attempted assassination of State Senator John Hoffman and his wife. U.S. prosecutors say Bolter had a list of dozens of political targets, surveilled several of their homes with detailed written notes. This is Democratic Governor Tim Walz late last night on the escalating political rhetoric that turned deadly.
A moment in this country where we watch violence erupt. This cannot be the norm. It cannot be the way that we deal with our political differences. Now's the time for us to recommit to the core values of this country. And each and every one of us can do it. Talk to a neighbor rather than arguing. Debate an issue. shake hands, find common ground.
And for more, let's turn now to Lara Brown, political scientist and presidential historian. She's also the author of Amateur Hour, Presidential Character, and The Question of Leadership. Lara, welcome back to Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Thanks for having me.
You know, when you look at this happening, we've heard for many, many years they have to change security when it comes to lawmakers. Do you believe this is the time it will finally happen?
Well, certainly security is a piece of this problem. I mean, we do have a secret service because during the Gilded Age, we saw so many presidential assassinations. And so it's important to realize that we do as a country tend to respond as opposed to kind of prepare. And I think this is a time where we should look at all the political violence that has been occurring and take stock, really consider preparing for a future. So security for lawmakers is a piece of that, and a congressional investigation into all of these incidents, I do think would be warranted.
Lara, when we call you, it's usually because we're seeking perspective on a moment in time. And here we are again, after what we saw last weekend, knowing that this suspect also had a kill list. A lot of lawmakers are looking around wondering what's happening when you add this to the backdrop of political violence on the streets in Los Angeles, thousands in the No Kings protests around the country. What is this moment that we're in?
Well, I think what is true is something that has been true now for about 3 decades. If you really think about what started in the early 1990s, where both parties began to kind of ferociously attack one another, we had a brief pause in this partisan polarization around the tragedy that was 9/11. But when you move forward to everything from the Tea Party to Occupy Wall Street, to these various movements that have really been seeking to gain a majority coalition, and no one has been able to do that. And it's because we disagree fundamentally about what the problems are in the country and how to solve them. And until we reach some consensus, there really, I don't think, will be a de-escalation in the rhetoric and probably a sort of disavowing of this political violence in a widespread way.
Lara, touching on the environment that is happening right now, you look at people running for office. It's challenging to raise money. It's challenging to go through the process. Do you think when you see threats that people will say, this just simply isn't worth it for me?
Well, I do think people have already said that. You know, there has been a change in the kind of character of our leaders. We always used to talk about the fact that there used to be political workhorses and then there used to be political show horses. And I think we are in a phase where many more people who are running for office are those who are seeking the limelight. They want to be show horses. They want to be kind of, you know, incendiary on social media to grab the attention, when in fact it is precisely that sort of rhetoric that often brings in the idea that you're at war with the other side, that ends up leading to people who are already susceptible and vulnerable to kind of violent thoughts, then stepping over the line and not actually wanting to understand that in this country, we simply disagree with each other with words, not with violence.
We saw a big parade over the weekend, Lara, at the same time as these No Kings protests were taking place in 2,000 cities and towns around the country, involving an incredible number of people. Donald Trump was in a viewing stand here in Washington, having closed down a lot of streets for a military parade that he was told at one point would tear up the streets of D.C. That didn't happen, but I wonder what lessons we learned in this exercise.
Well, I mean, quite frankly, One of the axioms in political science that is real is that the more force you show, the less authority you have. And so why so many people were opposed to this is because, and even Peggy Noonan talked about this in a Wall Street Journal op-ed. This is not what America traditionally does. We usually don't show our guns because we see that as being gaudy. We know that we have the authority. We don't need to brag about it. And bragging about it actually makes you appear weak. And it is something that other sort of individuals who are looking for strength tend to do. So this very different mindset about what strength is I think part of where our culture is fighting each other.
Lara, it's great to have you back. Political scientist, presidential historian Lara Brown, we thank you as always.
Thanks.
Coming up, Republican Congressman French Hill of Arkansas joins us, the chairman of the House Financial Services Committee, to talk about the Senate's markup of the House tax bill and the continued escalation that we're seeing in the Middle East. We have new details on both. We'll run them past the chairman next on Balance of Power. Alongside Julie Fine in Washington, I'm Joe Matthew. This is Bloomberg TV and Radio.
Well, I hope there's going to be a deal. I think it's time for a deal, and we'll see what happens. But sometimes they have to fight it out, but we're going to see what happens. I think there's a good chance there'll be a deal.
President Trump at the White House Sunday saying he believes Israel and Iran may need to continue fighting before they're ready to broker a peace deal. For the details on the escalating conflict, let's turn now to Bloomberg's Mike Shepard. Mike, always great to be with you.
Great to be with you, Julie.
You heard the president really reiterate that today when he just spoke at the G7. I mean, how likely is it that they will come to the table, and what role do you believe the United States is going to have with that?
It's a great question, because this is something that Donald Trump very much wants to see happen. He would like to see a deal materialize on Iran's nuclear program, but one more on the U.S. terms. And one of the key sticking points, and one that really burst into the open last week ahead of Israel's attack on Iran, was the U.S. insistence that Iran give up all uranium enrichment capabilities and any more processing of that fuel, in part because the U.S. and the IAEA find that Iran has amassed enough highly enriched uranium to possibly make as many as 10 nuclear weapons. Iran insists that its capabilities are all for civilian purposes, but Israel has its doubts. And that's, of course, what got us to where we are today. We're now entering almost the fifth day of this conflict between Israel and Iran. And Donald Trump is seeing this moment as, it's really the biggest military exchange between Israel and Iran, two longtime adversaries in decades. And Donald Trump is seeing this moment as one that could be the one that forces Iran to deal with the West once and for all.
I spoke to Ron Dermer earlier today, the Minister of Strategic Affairs for Israel, who was not mincing words to suggest that they do intend to finish the job in eliminating not only the nuclear program, but Iran's ballistic missile program. Are these calls by Iran to go back to the negotiating table going to fall on deaf ears?
Well, when it comes to Israel, Israel is moving at its own pace, independent of whatever diplomacy we may see on the nuclear front. They do not trust Iran to fulfill whatever deal that they may ultimately sign with the U.S. and with, other Western powers. And it was interesting, earlier today we reported that Donald Trump had quashed this idea of a G7 communique urging Israel and Iran to find a way to de-escalate the conflict. Instead, the President of the United States would prefer that Israel continue to pursue this as a way to pressure Iran to get to the bargaining table and, extract the best terms possible. And for Israel, though, Joe, the question, it really is also an existential one. They have seen for decades what they perceive as this great threat from Iran, both on the nuclear front, but also, as you brought up, Joe, the ballistic missile front. And since Friday, they have inflicted extensive damage on the missile and nuclear capabilities of the Islamic Republic. And they said, according to your interview with the Minister of Strategic Affairs, Ron Dermer, they are moving ahead of schedule. So they have a plan in mind and some objectives in mind that they would like to achieve.
Well, Bloomberg's Mike Shepard. Thank you, Mike. As always, we now want to add the voice of Republican Congressman French Hill of Arkansas, of course, chair of the House Financial Services Committee. He's also a member of the House Intelligence Committee. And Mr. Chairman, it's great to see you. Welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. I'd like to start with you on this from your perch on the Intel Committee. Israel says it's going for it and is determined to end Iran's nuclear program as well its ballistic missile programs. The conventional wisdom is, though, it cannot do that without the U.S.'s help offensively, without U.S. weapons, bunker-busting bombs to get to the likes of Fordo. From your perch on the Intel Committee, should the U.S. get involved now and help Israel close the deal?
Well, Joe and Julie, it's good to be with you. First, let me say that Israel certainly has the right to its self-defense. And as Michael Shepard just reported, they view this as an existential threat. And they've had success this year in the dismantling of the Iranian proxies of Hezbollah and Hamas in Lebanon, Syria, and obviously in Gaza. And that has been the force projection that Iran has had for years to meet their stated foreign policy objective, which is what? To wipe Israel off the face of the earth. So I don't see Israel stopping. I see Israel ramping up that pressure. And you've seen both the United States and France, for example, urging Iran to fold their cards, come back to the negotiating table, because they don't see any indication that Israel is going to change their force posture.
Well, as we surge more assets into the region, we understand the USS Nimitz carrier strike group is now on its way to get back to having two in the theater. Apparently, we are preparing for anything at this point, Congressman. What are you hearing on the Intel Committee about damage already done? How far back has Israel set Iran's nuclear program?
Well, I can't talk about what we've done or not done at the Intelligence Committee, but just looking at Israel's stated objectives and looking at press reporting, they're commencing one of the broadest ranges of sustained damage against the Iranian regime. And the question is, how much more does Iran want to take in terms of military attacks on their homeland? This could have all been changed if the Biden administration had kept the pressure up that President Trump started in his first term by cranking up the financial screws against the mullahs and the Ayatollah in Tehran, and he didn't do it. He freed up Iran to sell oil on the world market, 80% of it being sold to China, freeing up all kinds of money to fund terror activities and this nuclear program. He also freed up money that had been frozen from previous sanctions. So a lot of the advancements in this nuclear program in Iran are due to the bad foreign policy decisions by Joe Biden.
I want to turn to what's happening now in Capitol Hill. We're finally seeing some text from the Senate Finance Committee regarding the tax bill, and you are already seeing congressmen and women unhappy about the SALT cap, where it ended up at $10,000. You know, your reaction to that, and what is it going to take to meet that self-imposed July 4th deadline?
I think the senators are working overtime on their process of reviewing the big, beautiful bill, see what changes they would make. But I agree with Mike Johnson, our speaker, when he said, look, there's room in the tax proposals and there's room in the spending proposals for Senate review and Senate changes. But it's not like you're going to tear the whole house down and build a new house. We've laid the foundation. We've built a solid House that has a very balanced set of votes in the House among Republicans. And it's just not subject to radical change, I would say. It's still a 5,000 square foot house. It's subject to some modest remodeling, but not total new construction. And one of those things is, as you say, the SALT cap, which is very important to that balance in the House. And were they to change it in too much of a material way or take it out, I think you'd find the House sending it right back to the Senate. So I think Mike Johnson has urged caution for radical changes in the proposal that we sent over to the Senate.
Will there be a conference committee? Mr. Chairman, how's this going to work? Obviously, they've zeroed out some lines here. They put some placeholders in for this bill to go back to the House, but there's going to be a whole other knockdown, drag-out fight with the New York and New Jersey delegations here, right?
Sure, there certainly could be a conference committee, but look, Mike Johnson and Leader Thune are working hand in glove with the Trump administration, and all the views of the senators, particularly obviously in the Republican conference in the Senate, to find a landing space that works for the Senate and can also work for the House, so that President Trump can get his spending priorities for the border, for defense, for energy independence, and for curtailing the radical post-pandemic spending binge set off by Joe Biden. All those are the objectives in this bill, and I think the House carefully crafted the right balance under the leadership of our committees and our Speaker and our Majority Leader. So that's where it stands, and I hope the Senate can make progress so that we can deliver that bill to President Trump before Independence Day in just a few days.
Chairman, before we let you go, I do want to ask you about the tragedy this past weekend with the two lawmakers in Minnesota. You know, we've talked about this for many years on Capitol Hill. Is it time that each lawmaker has some sort of security detail, or what changes do you hope come from this?
Well, it was even more sad and more emotionally draining over the weekend because that happened on the 14th, Flag Day, the 8th anniversary of Steve Scalise and our GOP baseball team being targeted by an assassin as they practiced early in the morning 8 years ago. So there was a lot of emotional concern by members of Congress on both sides of the aisle about what happened in Minnesota. Members are urged to be cautious. They have to have security systems and to coordinate their activities with local law enforcement when they're outside Washington and in their home districts, and obviously to work and cooperate with Capitol Police both at home in their districts as well as in their movements in Washington, D.C. So I think caution is always been the watchword in public service ever since we witnessed the terrible Gabby Gifford shooting and many, many other things that have plagued public officials in the past. So I think you'll see a renewed call for caution and coordination with law enforcement as we're out in the public.
Republican Congressman French Hill of Arkansas, thanks so much for being with us. And coming up, we'll get a live report from the ground at the G7 and discuss how world leaders are approaching this face-to-face with President Trump when we assemble our political panel next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
I gave Iran 60 days, and they said no. And the 61st, you saw what happened. Day 61. So I'm in constant touch. And as I've been saying, I think a deal will be signed, or something will happen, but a deal will be signed. And I think Iran is foolish not to sign one.
That was President Trump earlier this hour at the G7 in Alberta, Canada, alongside UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer, and where we find Bloomberg's David Gura once again as global leaders prepare for that annual family photo. David, a busy day today. Tell me what you're expecting this evening.
Extremely busy day. We've got one more working group session here before the night, and then there'll be that family photo. And of course, this takes on a lot of, we like to kind of watch and see who's pairing up with whom, what interactions they might have. But a lot of us still remembering that photo from 2018, the last time the G7 was held here in Canada, where you had President Trump sitting down and then an array of world leaders kind of standing above him, Angela Merkel, the now former German chancellor, pointing at him. So photographs of this event are significant because they allow us to kind of game out or to judge or think through the psychology of what's happening in the room. But this has been a busy day with a lot of bilateral meetings. Certainly on the Canadian side, Mark Carney, the Prime Minister, is trying to have bilateral meetings with each of the G7 nations, but also the others that he's invited here. President Trump has had a few of them as well. Of course, that meeting with Keir Starmer, the UK Prime Minister, producing a codified version of the trade deal that they came together to sign a few weeks back in the White House. So we'll watch as all of that unfolds and see what reports we get of sort of what's happening along the sidelines here. And again, just to reiterate, the biggest issues kind of casting a shadow over this, of course, the conflict in the Middle East and trade policy, tariffs, and sort of what agreements might come together here along the lines of what we saw with the UK or be what we're watching for closely here tonight as we move into more sessions tomorrow, guys.
Looking ahead to a 10:30 p.m. sunset, Bloomberg's David Gura joining us from Canada. We thank you. Gorgeous shot. Joining us now for their reaction and expectations for the G7, this evening's political panel. Bloomberg Politics contributors Rick Davis, partner at Stone Court Capital, our Republican strategist, alongside Democratic analyst Djerejian Zeno, senior democracy fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. It's great to see you both here. I don't know your thoughts on this because this deal sounds a lot like the one hammered out a couple of weeks ago. It's a framework for a larger deal. When Peter Navarro says 90 deals in 90 days, how are they going to get that done?
I don't know if they're going to get 90 deals in 90 days, but they do seem to be moving forward, and that is good news for all of us. You know, this has been problematic for the markets. It has been destabilizing as you look at Donald Trump's political acumen. The latest polls show his lowest numbers are still on the economy, cost of living, tariffs, and trade. Yeah. So it's really important, not just for us economically, but for the administration and Donald Trump politically, to get these deals done and to give people a sense as to what they can expect going forward into the, you know, school is going to be coming back into session, and then the holiday season is going to start.
Rick, this is something that you knew was coming. You know, they'd already discussed this with the UK. Does the president need to have another big deal or another big announcement at the G7 to really show that they are getting somewhere on tariffs and deals?
Julie, there's really no surprise here, right? This was already signed. Right. Donald Trump in the Oval Office, Keir Starmer in a factory. Donald Trump signed something. I guess he just signed it again. But this was an easy one. We have a trade surplus with the UK. It's like one of the few countries in the world where it actually benefits us to have the surplus with the UK, not the opposite. And so when you look at the trade folks and you ask them where we go from here, this was the easiest thing in the world to do, not the hardest thing in the world to do. So the hard stuff's about to begin. And I know that everyone is hopeful, as Jeannie said, that we start getting some trade deals with people who really matter. Yeah. But this was a start. They had to have a deliverable for the president today, so they delivered something that was already in the mail.
Knowing there'd be no communique coming out of this summit. We all remember the iconic photograph that David Gura refers to from 2018, the president sitting down, crossing his arms, Angela Merkel leaning over the desk, looking at him. Freeze frame that image. Fast forward to today. Jeannie, he's back. And this is happening against the backdrop of Israel and Iran firing missiles at each other for the better part of 4 days. How does that play when we consider the potential for a transatlantic split between Donald Trump and these other world leaders?
Yeah, I mean, and listening to him speak today, if anybody thought he was going to go over there and you know, be, you know, hugging and making nice with everybody, he went right in. He blamed the former Prime Minister of Canada and Barack Obama for pushing Russia out of the G8. He took on many members of the G7. He was very, very critical. So I think it is Donald Trump in an environment he likes, which is to attack or to criticize people who we traditionally think of as allies. I mean, this administration started off with, you know, we had J.D. Vance going into Europe and being so critical that many European leaders could barely believe what they were hearing.
Well, and he also brought this up in the context of Putin being part of the G7 once again. And he basically said right in front of Prime Minister Carney that it was the fault of Trudeau that he wasn't there anymore. I mean, how do you think this went over, A, with the world leaders, but B, in Canada, a country that he said he would like to make a 51st state?
Yeah, first of all, I think he's really behaving himself. I totally disagree with Jeannie. He said a lot of nice things about, you know, Prime Minister Carney. It was a love fest with Keir Starmer. I mean, if you had listened to Keir Starmer 2 years ago about Donald Trump, you thought, oh, my God, they'll never be in the room together. And yet he went out of his way to commend the transatlantic alliance and how important the relationship is between Britain and the U.S. Sure, he took a shot at the former Prime Minister of Canada. Obviously, no love lost there, but he hasn't been like pushing the 51st state line or how weak they are without us defending them. So I don't know. I think I see it totally differently. I see him being on like the best behavior a Donald Trump can possibly be on based on what his usual shtick is with foreign leaders. I don't think you're going to see that kind of contentious picture that we just saw from 2018. I think you're going to see him in amongst a group and a lot of smiles.
Well, he looked a lot happier with the Chancellor of Germany today. He did sit down with Chancellor Merz. Are there sideline meetings going right now that might help Donald Trump decide what to do when it comes to Israel? European leaders are very concerned the U.S. joins this effort offensively.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly a lot of sideline meetings going on about Israel and also about Ukraine and Russia. You know, the president has a real challenge on his hands as it pertains to what does he do in the case of Israel. And you've got our transatlantic partners on a very different thought process than the president is. And the president, quite frankly, has been speaking out of both sides of his mouth on this issue. On the one hand, he's looking for talks. He's looking to negotiate. He is saying don't go in. And on the other hand, he gave tacit approval to go in. So we're, I think, in my mind, unclear as to where this administration goes on Israel.
Rick Davis and Jean Zeno, thank you so much for being with us. It was great to all be at one table today. And tomorrow is the premiere of the new Bloomberg original show, Bullish, with Sonali Basak. The first episode features Citadel CEO Ken Griffin and a conversation about his political influence. Take a listen.
When you think about your political giving, when you think about the influence that you want to have and the mark you want to make, what's most important to you?
Well, I think you need to think about the arc of one's life. In my 20s, I gave my time. I didn't have money to give in my 20s. I gave my time. I actually tutored in the inner city of Chicago and saw firsthand the challenges that these young, in this case, boys and girls face in trying to break the cycle of poverty. Like, it's really, really tough work to tutor these kids who are so far behind. And at Citadel, one of the things that we support is we support our colleagues being involved in nonprofit organizations. We have several hundred colleagues who are on the boards of nonprofit institutions across the country, giving of their time to improve other people's lives. I'm really proud of that. That's such a part of the ethos and culture of the firm. Now, over the years, time became scarcer, money became more plentiful, started to give money to support public education reform. How do we help young men and women? In Chicago, one of the things I love doing is I would help to underwrite the cost of giving books to every newborn child in the city of Chicago. It's a well-established fact that the number of books a child is exposed to early in life actually has a disproportionate impact on their entire educational journey. If I looked at all the work that I did, though, in public education in particular, I would often see that work undermined by very poor political policies. In some sense, we often put the interest of the teachers union in front of the interest of the students. And if I wanted to see kids have a chance to get ahead of the United States, I decided it was important to support politicians, both Republicans and Democrats, who put education as a very important part of their platform. And over the years, I've continued to support candidates on both sides of the aisle who really do lead with an education-first policy.
It's interesting to hear you say that, because coming into this interview, I was going to ask about what mark you wanted to make on the Republican Party, but it sounds like you're not limited to that.
I'm not limited to that. I find in general I tend to agree with more of the policies from the Republican Party, but it's important to recognize people in both parties that really do lead the charge fighting for the interests of children.
Make sure to tune in to the premiere of Bloomberg's originals Bullish with Sonali Basak tomorrow. It'll be available online or on the terminal at 9 a.m. Eastern. You can watch it live on Bloomberg TV, 6 p.m. Eastern Time, as we rejoin with Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano. It just brings up the issue of money in politics. Rick, something that this administration has certainly embraced, not only money on the campaign trail, but the president's relationships with some of the wealthiest people in the country. Is this a Trump-only scenario, or does this outlive him in this administration?
No, absolutely not. And it's not a party only. It's not limited to Republicans. I mean, we used to be jealous of all the billionaires that were in the Democratic Party and, Hollywood and all the money that came out of there and New York City. And now you see it on a different footing. Probably no more important person in New York when it comes to the markets. And yet he's backing Republican candidates now. So it's going to be one of those things that are incredibly important to watch over time because they do have an inordinate impact on the politics of America.
It was interesting, though, to see Shinali point out that, say to him, it sounds like you're not just interested in Republicans. I think in a situation like that, are we looking at people that have their own agendas and can afford to just get them through?
Yeah, absolutely. That's why many reformers say the biggest reform we need in American government is campaign finance reform and lobbying reform. And it is very hard to get because the people in power make the rules and they benefit from it.
Perfect conversation with Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzana. We thank our panel for their insights. And thank you for joining us on Balance of Power. Alongside Julie Fine, I'm Joe Matthew. We'll do this again tomorrow on Bloomberg TV and radio.